Hello everyone, and welcome back to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to move past our discussion on scale to talking to this idea of generalization. Right? We sort of touched on generalization in the first video when we basically said that whenever we go and change our scale, we typically are going to have some change in the level of detail that's necessary. And when we go from, cartographically speaking, a larger scale to a smaller scale, right, we're reducing the amount of detail that we need, we're typically going to have to go through some process of generalization. And so we've defined generalization as reducing detail without losing key information. Right? And this key here is the key word. Right? When we're talking about detail, we're talking about key information. And so what is key information? Well, key information is really going to depend on the drastic change in the scale. You know, if you're only changing it minorly, maybe you're not going to lose as much detail versus if you're going from, say, 1 to 1,000 to 1 to 1 million, right, you're going to have a much more drastic loss in detail. But generally speaking, key information is going to be things like location, shape, and area. Right, these are the things that you're going to be looking to try to maintain as best as you can when you start to modify essentially the vertices when it comes to vector data, or when we do any sort of resampling when it comes to raster data. So when it comes to generalization, I just want to be clear here that generalization occurs when we're thinking from the cartographic perspective. Right, again. It's always important to keep in mind which type of scale you're talking about. When we go from a large scale, right, lots of detail, to a small scale, right, we're losing detail. Right, and this loss of detail has to be addressed by generalization. And the nice thing is that generalization gives us a sort of thought process and a workflow and a tool set in terms to be able to make the most efficient use of this reduction in detail. Now, there's going to be a lot of cases that are going to bring about this idea of generalization. And again, large scale to small scale. But those sort of instances largely can be boiled down into 4 categories. Right, 4 categories when generalization is needed. So these are going to be things that as you change map scale, you're going to want to be looking for. And if you see them, you're going to want to apply some sort of generalization technique. So the first thing that you're going to want to look out for is something called congestion. And essentially, congestion occurs when you change the map scale, because you have to realize that even though in sort of theory, right, points and lines don't have a width, they take up a certain number of pixels on a screen. And when you change scale, right, or I guess in theory if you're drawing a map by hand, right, the tip of your pencil has a width to it. And when you start to zoom out, right, you can end up with things that originally had space between them starting to be pushed closer and closer and closer together, so that the physical lines actually start to become really close together or congested. Right? So a good example of this would be if we had some islands, right? We have maybe two islands. And at one scale, right, they're like this. We've got all of this space, right? All this space in between here. Perfect, right? Everything is clear and defined and separated. But as we zoom out and zoom out and zoom out, right, as we go from large scale to small scale, right, the size of the maps might get smaller. But then also too, right, the distance between them also starts to get smaller. And you can see that all of this space that we originally had, right now, you start to lose that. So this process here, this is congestion, right? And this basically congestion occurs when objects at large scale begin to compete for space at smaller scales. So you can think of congestion as literally just when you shrink the map scale, things just start to become congested. We can take that a step further and we can get what's called coalescence. Right? Coalescence, right, takes congestion a step further, and now we actually have objects overlapping each other. Right, so these two are going to require us to take one approach to generalization, and we'll talk about the approaches to generalization in the next video. But this is something you really start to see, especially when you make drastic changes to your scale, is that things are going to start to go on top of each other and just look really congested. Another issue that can arise is this idea of conflict. Right? And so the way that I like to think about conflict is basically when you are undergoing some form of generalization to one data set and it interrupts the interpretation or the geographic reality of another data set. So a good example of this would be if in one data set, right, we had something that looked like this. We had a bay, right? We had a bay that went something like this. We had a peninsula and a bay, right? Something like this. And we had a town, right? So this would be the bay and the peninsula, right? And we had a village, right? We had a village, right, on that peninsula, right? So this could be a point representing a city, right, on this peninsula. And then we zoom out and we cut all of this geometry away so that when we zoom out, right, we go like this, right? And our village is now dangling in the water, right? This is all water, right? So what we've done here is we've done some generalization to the shoreline geometry. But in doing that, we've actually created this reality disconnect where our village is now just floating in the water, which is not realistic, right? This isn't geographically what we would want. So then what we would have to do is we would have to go in and edit either the shape of the coastline to bring it out, or move the point in. So we sort of broken that reality a little bit, or broken the accuracy, I should say, the accuracy of one of these data sets to account for the fact that this is not, right, this is wrong, right? We don't want this to happen. We don't want our village to be floating in the water. It doesn't make realistic sense, so we have to edit that to bring it back in line with what we would expect in reality. Right, so conflict is essentially when generalization in one data set breaks the geographic reality of another. Right, and you can imagine the same thing happening, for example, if we had a bridge, right, a bridge going across this bay, and we cut that out, the bridge would then be just floating over the ocean with no land on either side of it. Right? I know I'm kind of harping on this idea of shoreline, but that's one of the easiest ways, I think, to wrap your mind around it, is that when we've generalized one, we have to pay attention to the fact that we might be breaking the sort of geographic reality of another, making these inconsistencies that don't make sense. And when someone is interpreting our map, they might be, it's one of those like, oh wait, that's a mistake, right? And you never want someone to look at your map and remember the mistakes, right? That's sort of a bad optics, right? You don't want people to remember the mistakes. So you'd have to keep in mind for conflict. And then finally, the fourth sort of issue that we want to keep an eye out for is this idea of complication. Right? And complication is actually complication and congestion are probably the two most common forms of generalization issues that you're going to see. Because you can already see with congestion, right, you can imagine that's pretty frequently happening. Complication is another one, and I think complication is probably the one that you're most used to seeing change without even thinking about it. But complication is essentially addressing this idea that when you zoom out from a shape, that the fine details that were present in the original shape become noise. And let me show you what I mean. Right, so if we have something that looks like this nice zigzag pattern, right, this you can clearly see the shape and pattern here. But if I do something like that, right, you'll see that granted I can't draw here, but you can see what happened when we zoomed this shape out. You can see that this now looks really noisy, right? And so this change from this sort of observable pattern to this random almost noise, this is complication, right? It's the idea that as you reduce the scale, right, as you go to a smaller scale, those fine details actually become noise. Right? And I think this is something that you see so often in maps that you don't even think about it. Right? If you're flipping through an atlas of any of the coastline of the United States, right, when you look at a county map, right, it'll have a fairly detailed coastline, and then you flip to that same piece of coastline in a state map, right, it's going to be more generalized. And then if you flip to the entire United States, it's going to be even more generalized, right? You might start to have things like what we talked about here happening, where we cut out some of these bays and make some of these bays into straight lines. Because again, right, that fine scale detail will just become noise. It will make your map look worse, which again is never the point. So again, just to sort of reiterate here, generally speaking, you're going to be looking for 4 things when you start to change your map scale. Congestion and coalescence, which is the idea that as you change scale, things are going to start to move closer together and overlap, because even though in reality lines don't have width, pens and computer monitors give them a width. Coalescence and congestion. You also need to be aware of conflict, where as we change the shape and modify and generalize one set, we have to be paying attention to what that does to the geographic relationships in another set. And then finally, we have this idea of complication, which is as you change your scale, you have to be aware that sometimes your fine scale details will actually become noise and can make the overall map look worse. So hopefully this makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.